In 1917, this factory shook the ground beneath it. 5,500 workers producing 3.7 million hats a year. 16 million animal pelts passing through those doors annually. An 8-story clock tower marking the rhythm of an empire that had made the name Stetson synonymous with the American West. They had survived the Depression, survived 2 world wars, built a community so complete that people called it a city within a city. Hospital, auditorium, kindergarten, homes purchased through company loans. Generations of families walking through the same gates their grandfathers had walked through. This was the peak, the absolute summit. And the men who stood on that factory floor, feeling it pulse beneath their feet, had no way of knowing they were standing at the edge of something that would simply cease to exist. Chapter 1. The Dying Man. The corner of 4th Street and Montgomery Avenue in North Philadelphia holds nothing now, an empty lot where weeds have won their decades-long battle against concrete. A few scattered buildings that have forgotten what they were. And if you didn't know to look, if someone hadn't told you, you'd never guess that this patch of urban vacancy was once the center of an empire. 9 acres, 25 buildings, 1.4 million square feet of factory floor, an 8-story clock tower that dominated the skyline, its bell marking the rhythm of 5,000 lives. This was the John B. Stetson Company, the largest hat factory the world had ever seen. The bell is gone now. Or rather, it's been relocated, stored for nearly 40 years in museum storage, a 2,500-pound artifact that nobody quite knew what to do with. It crashed into the ash and rubble on September the 4th, 1980, when arsonists burned what remained of the factory complex. A teenager reportedly found the clapper in the wreckage and offered to sell it back for $150. The Historical Commission declined. Walk these blocks today and you'll find one building still standing from the Stetson era. The hospital. Opened in 1905 to serve factory workers and their families, it now houses a methadone clinic. The same walls that once treated hatters' shakes, the tremors that came from mercury poisoning, now treat a different kind of affliction. The neighborhood has changed. The need for care hasn't. But stand on this corner long enough, and if you're quiet, if you listen past the traffic and the sirens and the ordinary noise of a city that's moved on, you can almost hear what used to be. The hiss of steam, the thrum of machinery, the factory whistle calling workers to their stations. Almost. The question that hangs over this empty lot is the question that hangs over 100 ruined factories across America. How does something this big, this successful, this woven into the fabric of a community, how does it simply disappear? The answer, like most answers worth having, begins with a single person, a man who was supposed to die young, a man who went west looking for nothing more than a few good months before the end, and came back with an idea that would change American fashion forever. His name was John Batterson Stetson. And before we can understand how his empire fell, we need to understand what he built and why it mattered. John Batterson Stetson was born to make hats. This wasn't metaphor. It was inheritance. He entered the world on May 5, 1830 in Orange, New Jersey, the 7th of 12 children born to Stephen and Susan Stetson. The family business was hat making, had been for generations. Stephen Stetson operated a firm called the No.1 Hat Company, so christened because the family couldn't agree on what to call it. According to family lore, the Stetsons had made hats for George Washington himself. Whether that was true or just the kind of story families tell, young John grew up surrounded by the trade. His father taught him felting before he could read. His mother taught him reading at home. There was no formal schooling, no classroom education, just felt and fiber and the ancient craft of turning animal fur into something that could sit on a man's head. By his late 20s, Stetson was working in his father's shop, learning the finer points of the trade. He had a gift for it, an instinct for what felt right in the hand, what looked right on the head. He might have spent his entire life in that New Jersey shop, turning out hats indistinguishable from his father's, carrying on the family tradition until his own sons took over. Then a doctor told him he was going to die. Tuberculosis. The diagnosis arrived sometime in the late 1850s, and it carried the weight of a death sentence. Consumption, they called it then. The wasting disease. The physician gave Stetson only a short time to live. Weeks, perhaps months. The young hatter's lungs were failing. There was no cure. What do you do when someone tells you you're dying? John Stetson decided to see the West. The reasoning was practical as much as romantic. Dry mountain air was supposed to be good for consumptive lungs, and if he was going to die anyway, he might as well die having seen something beyond New Jersey. So he packed what he could carry and headed toward the frontier. His first stop was St. Joseph, Missouri, where he found work managing a brickyard. It wasn't hat making, but it was work, and work meant survival. For a time, it looked like Stetson might build a new life there. Tuberculosis be damned. Then the Missouri River flooded and washed his investment away. The brickyard was gone. So was his money. When the Civil War erupted, Stetson tried to enlist. The Army rejected him. His lungs, they said. He wasn't fit for service. A dying man couldn't fight. So he kept moving west. He fell in with a band of prospectors heading toward Pikes Peak during the Colorado Gold Rush. They weren't exactly friends, more like fellow travelers, men united by the shared delusion that there was gold in those mountains, and that they might be the ones to find it. Stetson wasn't looking for gold. He was looking for air he could breathe and time he wasn't supposed to have. What he found on those high plains and mountain passes was the idea that would make him rich. The prospectors wore ridiculous hats. This was Stetson's observation, and it came from a man who knew hats the way a carpenter knows wood. Coonskin caps that attracted fleas and smelled like death after a week on the trail. Wool derbies that wilted in the first rainstorm and never recovered their shape. Sea captains' hats that did nothing against the relentless western sun. These men were trying to survive in a brutal landscape, and they were wearing headwear designed for eastern cities. One evening, around the campfire, Stetson decided to show his companions what he knew. He gathered fur from the animal hides they had lying around, beaver, rabbit, whatever was available, and demonstrated the process his father had taught him. He shaved the fur from the pelts. He agitated it with a hickory bow, separating the fine down from the coarser guard hairs. He sprayed a fine mist through the fibers, then dipped the matted material into boiling water. Through some combination of heat and moisture and pressure, the fur began to felt, the fibers tangling and binding into a material that was stronger than the sum of its parts. From this felt, Stetson fashioned a hat, 4-inch crown, 4-inch brim, tall and broad, modeled on the Mexican sombreros he'd seen on the frontier. It looked nothing like the hats men wore back east. His companions laughed at him. The hat looked absurd. A few days later, a bullwhacker came through their camp, a teamster driving an ox-drawn wagon across the plains. He saw Stetson's hat. He tried it on, and he reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 gold piece. "I'll take it," he said. $5 for a hat made from scraps around a campfire. It was more than many men earned in a week of hard labor. John B. Stetson had just made the first sale of his life. Something remarkable happened to John Stetson in that dry mountain air. His lungs began to heal. The tuberculosis that was supposed to kill him retreated. Whether it was the altitude, the climate, or simply the mystery of a body that refuses to follow a doctor's predictions, Stetson found himself growing stronger, rather than weaker. By 1865, he was well enough to travel east again. He was 35 years old. He'd been given months to live, and he'd survived. He returned to Philadelphia with approximately $100, some of it his own savings, some borrowed from his sister. It was enough to rent a single room at the corner of 7th and Callow Hill streets. Enough to purchase $10 worth of beaver fur. Enough to begin. Stetson started making hats. At first, he did what any sensible hatter would do. He copied the fashionable styles that sold well in eastern cities. Bowlers, darbies, the kinds of hats Philadelphia gentlemen were wearing. The sales were adequate, nothing more. Then he asked himself a question that would change his life. Why not sell hats somewhere else? The answer was obvious once he thought about it. He'd seen the western frontier with his own eyes. He knew what men out there needed, and what they weren't getting. They needed hats that could handle sun, rain, wind, and dust. Hats that wouldn't fall apart after a month on the trail. Hats built for working men in a working landscape. He created the boss of the plains. The name alone tells you something about Stetson's instinct for marketing. This wasn't the Western hat or the Frontier model or any other generic label. It was the boss of the plains, the hat that conquered the West. The design drew from his Pikes Peak prototype, a 4-inch crown that created an insulating pocket of air above the head, crucial in both scorching summers and bitter winters. A 4-inch flat brim that shielded the face and neck from sun, rain, and hail. Beaver felt so tightly woven and carefully processed that it was essentially waterproof. Cowboys would later discover you could use a Stetson to carry water to your horse, and the hat would hold. But the real innovation wasn't the hat. It was how Stetson sold it. He obtained a list of every hat dealer in the American Southwest, every general store, every mercantile, every outfitter who might stock headwear for the men settling the frontier. Then he did something no hat maker had done before. He sent each of them an actual sample hat, along with an order form specifying a minimum purchase of 1 dozen. Think about what this meant in 1865. A dealer in Texas or Arizona or Montana had never seen a Stetson, had never heard of John B. Stetson. And suddenly, in the mail, he receives this hat, this strange, broad-brimmed, perfectly crafted thing, along with a note that essentially says, "Here's what I'm selling. Order a dozen or don't. Up to you." They ordered. Within weeks, orders were flooding into that small Philadelphia room. Some dealers sent cash in advance, hoping it would move them to the front of the line. Word spread among the men who bought these hats, and those men told other men, and demand outstripped everything Stetson could produce. He needed to expand, fast. By 1866, barely a year after renting that single room, Stetson had outgrown his space. By 1870, he had taken over a row of houses on 4th and Montgomery Streets, knocking out walls to create a makeshift factory. By 1874, he commissioned architect George T. Pearson to design a proper factory complex in the Kensington neighborhood of North Philadelphia. The hat maker had become a manufacturer. The manufacturer would become an empire. Chapter 2. The Workshop of the World. The choice of Kensington was strategic. By the 1870s, Kensington had earned its nickname, the Workshop of the World. This was Philadelphia's industrial heartland, a dense concentration of factories and foundries and mills that turned raw materials into finished goods. Textiles, machinery, leather goods, iron and steel. The neighborhood hummed with the energy of production. For Stetson, the location offered everything he needed. Available land for expansion, and he would need to expand again and again as demand kept climbing. A deep pool of skilled immigrant labor, Irish and German and Polish workers who knew craft, who understood that quality required attention, who would commit to jobs that treated them well, and proximity to residential neighborhoods where those workers could live within walking distance of the factory gates. The complex rose from the corner of 4th Street and Montgomery Avenue. Building by building, year by year, Stetson added to his empire. A new felting facility, an expanded finishing shop, a dedicated building for shipping and receiving. By 1886, just 2 decades after starting with $100 and $10 worth of beaver fur, John B. Stetson operated the largest hat company in the world. The numbers tell part of the story. In 1865, Stetson had 2 employees, himself and 1 assistant. By 1899, he employed 1,200 workers and sold hats through 2,800 retailers nationwide. By 1906, the year of his death, the company employed approximately 5,000 workers producing 2 million hats annually. But numbers don't capture what the factory meant to the men and women who worked there. To understand that, you have to understand what Stetson was building alongside the hats. John B. Stetson was a devout Baptist. This wasn't incidental to his business philosophy. It was central to it. He believed that providing generously for workers was both a moral obligation and a practical strategy. Hat workers of that era were notoriously transient. They drifted from employer to employer, following better wages or better conditions, never settling anywhere for long. Stetson calculated that exceptional benefits would attract superior craftsmen and inspire the loyalty that kept them from drifting. What he created was one of the most comprehensive employee welfare programs in American industrial history. It started, as many things do, with a personal problem. Sometime in the mid-1880s, Stetson found himself suffering from catarrh, a chronic inflammation of the mucous membranes. He arranged for his personal physician to visit the factory twice weekly to treat him. One day, he noticed that several of his workers were suffering from the same condition. So he paid for their treatment too. From this simple act of extension grew something far larger. On February 5, 1887, Stetson opened a small dispensary on the factory grounds. In its first year, it served 3,745 patients. By 1898, annual visits had surged to 27,000. The demand had outgrown every expansion. So, in 1905, shortly before Stetson's death, a new facility opened, the Union Mission Hospital, later renamed Stetson Hospital. The hospital wasn't a company clinic. It was a full medical facility with X-ray capabilities, an operating room, a pharmacy, separate wards for men and women, and a nurses' training school. The cost to employees was $1 every 3 months, and free for anyone who couldn't afford even that. Over the decades, the hospital expanded to 75 beds and full accreditation, serving not just factory workers but the entire Kensington community. For generations of Philadelphia residents, Stetson Hospital was where they were born, where they recovered from illness, where their children came into the world. But healthcare was only the beginning. Stetson established a building and loan association that offered below-market mortgages to employees. Over 1,000 workers purchased homes through the program, homes they owned, not company housing they rented. This distinction mattered. When George Pullman built his company town in Illinois, workers rented from the company. When hard times came and wages were cut, rents stayed the same, and the resulting fury exploded into the Pullman strike of 1894. Stetson learned from that disaster. He wanted workers invested in their community, owning something permanent, building lives that extended beyond the factory gates. He distributed Christmas bonuses that increased with each year of service, a deliberate strategy to retain immigrant workers who might otherwise move on after a few seasons. He gave away shares of company stock as profit sharing. He established apprenticeship programs that paid young workers $2 a week to learn the trade over 3 years, contracts that notably prohibited both gambling and marriage, keeping apprentices focused on developing their craft. And then there was the auditorium. The Stetson Auditorium opened in May of 1906, 3 months after its founder's death. At 5,500 seats, it was the largest permanent hall in Philadelphia. The scale was deliberate. Stetson wanted a space that could hold his entire workforce at once, a gathering place that reinforced the identity of the Stetson family. The auditorium hosted weekly orchestra concerts, educational programs nearly every evening, and civic gatherings that brought the factory and the city together. President William Howard Taft spoke there. So did Charlie Chaplin, evangelist Billy Sunday, and baseball manager Connie Mack. But the events workers remembered best were the Christmas celebrations, legendary affairs where married men received turkeys, unmarried men received hats, and women received candy and gloves. The whole community gathered in one enormous room, celebrating the end of another year of production. Was it welfare capitalism? Certainly. Progressive labor advocates looked at the Stetson model and saw a variant of a feudal system, with the lives of the workers carefully controlled by the employer. The company magazine, The Hat Box, promoted a Stetson family identity and encouraged sacred reverence to John B. Stetson. There was calculation in the generosity, and yet, testimonies from workers suggest something more complicated than simple manipulation. There was genuine affection alongside awareness of paternalism. Workers who left Stetson for union jobs at other factories often returned. The Christmas bonuses, the home ownership, the hospital that treated your children, these things created loyalty that mere wages couldn't match. John B. Stetson died on February 18, 1906, at his mansion in DeLand, Florida. He reportedly suffered a stroke while preparing to bathe. He was 75 years old. At his death, he had given away nearly all his fortune to charitable causes, including the Florida Academy that would become John B. Stetson University, the state's first private university, whose athletic teams are still called the Hatters and whose mascot is named John B. He left behind a company with 5,000 employees, 25 buildings on 9 acres, and a name that had become synonymous with hat across the American West. He left behind something else too, a model for how a factory and a community could grow together, how workers could be treated with dignity and still produce profits, how loyalty could be earned rather than coerced. It would last for decades, and then it wouldn't. To understand what Stetson became after its founder's death, you need to understand what happened inside those buildings. The transformation of raw material into finished hat was an industrial symphony. Over 200 individual steps, performed by thousands of workers, refined over decades into a process that was both mechanized and handcrafted. It started with fur. 16 million animal pelts passed through the Stetson factory every year at peak production. Beaver, rabbit, wild hare, nutria, arriving in 250-pound bales from trappers and fur dealers across the continent. The pelts were sorted, graded, and sent to the back shop where the real work began. The back shop was the primal heart of the operation, raw and loud and thick with the smell of wet animal. The air carried what workers described as a dense wild animal odor, the scent of pelts being stripped of their fur, of down and guard hair separated by machinery that had been retrofitted from cotton gins. The process began with the fur blown through those modified gins, comb rollers stripping the fine down from coarser fibers. 8 ounces of this down would then be vacuum sucked onto a spinning metal cone called the former, a contraption that looked like nothing else in American industry, designed specifically for creating hat bodies. The cone, wrapped in wet burlap, was submerged in water heated to 160 degrees. What emerged was called a boat sail, a loose, fragile shell of felt 8 times larger than the finished hat would be. From there, the real transformation began. The boat sail was rolled under pressure, soaked and squeezed through 7 separate operations, each one shrinking and tightening the fibers. By the end, that 8 times oversized shell had compressed to 1/4 its original size, the felt so dense and tightly woven that it was essentially waterproof. The felted body moved on to dyeing, submerged in stainless steel vats filled with proprietary colorways, colors that Stetson had perfected over decades and guarded as trade secrets. Then came shellacking. The felt was fortified with a lac, a resinous substance secreted by beetles, which strengthened the material and gave it a subtle sheen. Now came the art. The process called tipping, shaping the rough felt body over molded blocks, required workers with 4 to 6 months of training in hands that had developed an instinct for the material. The tipper held the dampened felt over a wooden form and worked it into shape, coaxing the crown and brim into existence. Each tipper had their own technique, their own touch. The best could feel when the felt was right before their eyes confirmed it. From tipping, the hat moved to wet blocking, pressed in machines that resembled giant waffle irons, hot water and pressure setting the basic shape. Then dry blocking, multiple sessions, each one refining the form further. The process called pouncing involved conditioning the felt with fine oil and sanding it with pumice to create the texture, silky smooth for dress hats, slightly napped for Western styles. Brim cutting, crown shaping. 54 different crown-style molds existed in the factory, representing every permutation of regional preference and fashion trend. The brims were flange molded at 275 degrees with 80 pounds of pressure, creating the crisp edges that distinguished a Stetson from lesser hats. The front shop handled finishing, 30 separate stations, each performing a specific task: swirling satin lining into the crown, sewing the bow at the base of the crown, backstitching leather hatbands, the ribbon, the binding, the sweatband with Stetson's name embossed on it, a personal guarantee of quality from a man who'd been dead for decades, but whose reputation still sold hats. The final inspection was performed by veteran employees, men and women who had been doing this work for 20, 30, 40 years. They knew what a Stetson was supposed to feel like. They could detect flaws invisible to untrained eyes. They tested the felt's resistance by pinching the crown, a distinctive thwip that told them everything they needed to know about the material's integrity. 4 weeks from raw pelt to finished hat. Over 200 steps. And each hat carried that embossed sweatband, that guarantee, that name. Chapter 3. A City Within. A city. Imagine arriving for the morning shift. It's 1925, and you're one of 540 workers who pass through the gates at 4th and Montgomery every working day. You live 4 blocks away, in a row house your father purchased with a loan from the company's building and loan. Your father worked this floor before you. His father before him. 3 generations of your family have made hats in this building. You can hear the factory before you see it. The hum of machinery carries through the morning air, a vibration so constant that people who grow up in its shadow stop noticing it, until the day it stops and the silence feels wrong. The complex sprawls across nearly 9 acres, 25 buildings, brick and mortar, windows on every floor to catch the natural light that makes inspection possible. The 8-story clock tower dominates the corner, its bell marking the start of each shift, the end of each day, the rhythm of 5,000 lives. You punch your time card and make your way to your station. The floor beneath your feet shakes with the rhythm of machinery, stamping and pressing and cutting, the coordinated violence of industrial production. The air is different in different sections. In the back shop, that dense animal smell. In the blocking area, steam and heat, the hiss of hot water. In the finishing department, the click of Singer 103 sewing machines, irreplaceable 1920s models, still running smooth after decades of use. Good hats make steady jobs. The signs are everywhere, a reminder and a promise. Your co-workers come from the same neighborhoods you do. Irish from St. Michael's Parish, Polish from St. Laurentius, German craftsmen whose families brought their skills from the old country. The factory runs Americanization classes for the newest immigrants. English language, citizenship preparation, the practical knowledge of how to be American while making American hats. At noon, the factory whistle blows. Half an hour for lunch. Some workers eat in the cafeteria the company provides. Others step out to the neighborhood businesses that exist because the factory exists. Joe McVeigh's Oyster Saloon. Cyberlick's Tobacco with its wooden cigar store Indian chained to the post outside. The street is alive with the movement of workers. This is what prosperity looks like. Not wealth necessarily, but activity, purpose, a town that has a reason to exist. Saturday is different. Saturday afternoon, after the half-day shift, there are baseball games on the company athletic fields. 15 cents for general admission, 25 cents for the grandstand. The Brooklyn Royal Giants come through sometimes, a black team playing against the Factory 9, and the turnout is noted as a rarity for the era, workers watching across whatever lines usually divided them. The children go to Sunday school in the company auditorium, over 2,000 of them, the largest attendance of any Sunday school in Philadelphia. The women sew in the finishing department, constructing hat boxes and weaving straw for summer lines. The men cut and block and shape, developing skills that take years to master. Everyone knows the rhythm. Morning shift, lunch whistle, afternoon shift, evening bell, 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year. the same patterns repeating until they become life itself. What you can't know, what no one can know, is that this rhythm has a limit, that the floor will one day stop shaking, that the whistle will blow one final time, that your children's children won't follow you through those gates because there won't be gates to walk through. For now, there's only the work, the hum, the shaking floor, the steady job that makes steady hats. At its peak, the John B. Stetson Company didn't just dominate the hat industry. It defined it. The numbers from 1917 tell the story of an empire at absolute capacity. 5,500 workers producing 3.7 million hats per year, generating $11 million in revenue, the equivalent of roughly $200 million in today's currency. Net profit margins ran to 32% of sales. The factory processed 16 million pelts annually, more than any facility on Earth. But market share doesn't capture what the name meant. In the American West, Stetson wasn't a brand. It was a synonym. When a rancher said he needed a new Stetson, he didn't mean a specific product from a specific company. He meant a hat. Any hat. The name had transcended its origins to become the thing itself. Just as Colt meant revolver, Stetson meant the thing you put on your head before you walked out the door. The boss of the Plains, that original design from John B. Stetson's Pike's Peak days, had evolved into an entire vocabulary of Western identity. The 10-gallon, with its exaggerated crown and theatrical proportions. The Carlsbad, the rancher, the cattleman. Each style carried associations, indicated profession or affiliation or regional origin. A man's hat told you who he was before he opened his mouth. And the men who wore Stetsons weren't anonymous. Buffalo Bill Cody wore a Stetson in his Wild West shows, that massive white hat visible from the back row of the arena. Annie Oakley wore one too, the sharpshooter who could hit targets that men swore were impossible. Calamity Jane, Will Rogers. Tom Mix, Hollywood's first cowboy superstar, who reportedly owned dozens of custom Stetsons and helped transform the Western hat into a symbol of silver screen heroism. Then there was John Wayne. Wayne wore Stetsons on camera and off. His personal collection included custom big buck models made to his specifications, enormous hats for an enormous man, each one bearing the embossed sweatband, each one a guarantee of the quality that John B. Stetson had promised 50 years earlier. When Wayne strode across the screen in Stagecoach or Red River or The Searchers, he carried the factory with him. Every theater in America was watching a Philadelphia product. The white hat/black hat symbolism of Western movies, heroes in white, villains in black, didn't exist before Stetson created it. The company understood that hats were costumes, that the right hat could transform an ordinary man into a figure of authority or menace. They sold that understanding to Hollywood, and Hollywood sold it to the world. But Stetson's reach extended beyond the West and the screen. The company produced dress hats, fedoras, bowlers, Homburgs, for the Eastern markets that had once mocked the boss of the Plains. They introduced women's hats in 1930, expanding into a market they'd previously ignored. They won military contracts that put Stetson campaign hats on the heads of American soldiers in 2 world wars. In 1937, they introduced the open road, a Western-styled hat that somehow bridged the gap between cowboy and gentleman. It became so associated with Lyndon Baines Johnson that people still call it the LBJ hat. Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Reagan, and George W. Bush all wore Stetsons, each photograph reinforcing the connection between the brand and American authority. The factory on 4th and Montgomery wasn't just making hats. It was making identity, manufacturing symbols, shipping them across the country and around the world, each one carrying that embossed sweatband, that name, that promise. The factory created the neighborhood that surrounded it. This wasn't metaphor. It was economic fact. Kensington's growth tracked Stetson's growth. As the factory expanded, as employment climbed from dozens to hundreds to thousands, the residential streets around 4th and Montgomery filled with row houses built for workers who needed to live within walking distance of their shifts. The Building and Loan Association that helped workers purchase homes wasn't charity, it was infrastructure. A workforce that owned homes wouldn't drift away when another company offered a nickel more per hour. By the 1920s, Stetson had achieved what contemporaries called a city within a city. This wasn't simply a factory surrounded by residences. It was a complete ecosystem, every element supporting every other, each piece depending on the whole. The hospitals served not just workers but their families, their neighbors, anyone in the community who needed care. The auditorium hosted gatherings that drew the whole neighborhood. The kindergarten educated children while their parents worked the floor. Over 2,000 kids cycling through the company's early childhood programs. The Sunday school claimed the largest attendance in Philadelphia. Walk the streets around the factory in 1920, and you'd find an economy shaped entirely by Stetson wages. The saloons where workers stopped after the evening shift. The tappies, tap rooms, on every corner. Joe McVeigh's Oyster Saloon, where a man could get a dozen on the half-shell and a beer for the kind of prices only working people could appreciate. Cyberlich's Tobacco, that wooden Indian standing guard outside. Corner candy stores where kids spent their pennies. Midwives advertising in windows along 4th Street, ready to deliver the next generation of hatters. The supporting businesses understood their dependency. When the factory ran 3 shifts, the bars stayed open late. When production slowed in summer months, the seasonal lull between spring orders and fall production, the shops felt the pinch. The rhythm of the neighborhood was the rhythm of the factory. They were the same heartbeat. Churches anchored the ethnic communities that provided the labor. St. Michael's Roman Catholic Church had served the Irish since 1831, decades before Stetson arrived, but the congregation swelled as the factory grew. St. Laurentius Parish, founded in 1882, served the Polish workers who brought their own craft traditions and their own expectations for what a factory owed its employees. Multi-generational employment was the norm, not the exception. John Rudolph started at Stetson in 1917 at age 16. If you went in at the right time when they needed somebody, you got in right away, he remembered decades later. But very often they were filled up. There were so many people in the neighborhood. They all wanted to get into Stetson. Getting into Stetson meant something. It meant a life, a career, a house paid off through company loans, a pension at the end, medical care when you needed it. The knowledge that your children could follow you through those gates, could learn the trade from men who'd learned it from their own fathers. Mildred Schaefline's father worked for Stetson for 50 years and 3 months. 50 years. He started as a young man, rose to become union vice president and president of the Beneficial Association, and retired having spent his entire working life in a single factory. Mike Korsnack topped that, 52 years and 9 months, finally punching out in 1963. These weren't jobs. They were inheritances, legacies, identities passed from generation to generation like the family Bible. The company understood this, cultivated it. The Hatbox magazine, distributed to workers, promoted the concept of the Stetson family, one great enterprise, owners and workers together, united in the craft of making good hats. It was propaganda, certainly. It was also, for many workers, simply the truth of how they experienced their lives. A city within a city. Factory and neighborhood fused into something inseparable. What happened to one would happen to the other. The year was 1917. America had entered the Great War. Young men were shipping out to Europe and they needed hats, campaign hats, service caps, the headwear of an army mobilizing to fight. The contracts poured into Philadelphia, and the factory that had been running at full capacity somehow found another gear. 5,500 workers, 3.7 million hats, $11 million in revenue. The highest numbers the company would ever achieve. The complex had reached its final form, 25 buildings sprawling across nearly 9 acres, 1.4 million square feet of factory floor. the equivalent of 32 acres of production space stacked vertically into the Kensington skyline. The clock tower at the corner of 4th and Montgomery stood 8 stories tall, its bell audible for blocks in every direction. When that bell rang, 5,000 people moved. The executives who walked those floors in 1917 had every reason for confidence. The American hat market seemed inexhaustible. Every man in the country wore a hat. It was as essential as shoes. Fashion changed, certainly. Crowns rose and fell, brims narrowed and widened. But the basic fact of hat wearing appeared permanent. 42 million hats sold annually in a country of 100 million people. More hats than adult men, and Stetson led them all. Not just in Western wear, where the name was synonymous with the product, but across the entire industry. The company that had started with $100 and $10 worth of beaver fur now controlled the largest hat-making operation in human history. Stand on that factory floor in 1917 and feel the building shake with production. Hear the machinery running 24 hours a day, 3 shifts cycling through the work that never stopped. Smell the animal fur and the steam and the hot oil. Watch the hats move through their 200 steps from raw pelt to finished product, each one carrying that embossed sweatband. John B. Stetson Company, Philadelphia. The founder had been dead for 11 years. His son, G. Henry Stetson, oversaw operations now. The principles remained. Quality above all, generous treatment of workers, the belief that a well-pleased customer was the best advertisement. The system John B. had built appeared self-sustaining, a machine that would run forever if properly maintained. But something was already changing, though few could see it. The first automobiles were appearing on American streets. The first soldiers were returning from Europe with different ideas about formality and fashion. The first cracks in the hat-wearing consensus were forming, invisible hairline fractures that would widen over decades into chasms. 1917 was the peak, the absolute summit, the highest point before everything changed. The workers who punched in that year, who felt the floor shake beneath them and heard the bell mark their days, who walked home to Kensington row houses and raised children who would follow them through those gates. They couldn't know that they were standing at the top of something, that the world outside those walls was shifting in ways that would make everything they knew irrelevant. They couldn't know. How could they? They were making hats, 3.7 million of them, and each one sold. Chapter 4. The Death of the Hat. The change didn't announce itself. There was no single morning when American men woke up and decided collectively to leave their hats on the shelf. It happened slowly, then all at once, a generational drift that accelerated into a collapse. To understand what killed the American hat industry, you have to understand what hats meant before they died. In 1900, a hat wasn't fashion. It was civilization. A man who left his house bareheaded was making a statement, usually an unintentional one about his social standing or mental state. Different hats indicated different classes. Top hats for the upper crust, fedoras for the professional class, flat caps for workers, Homburgs for executives who wanted to signal seriousness without ostentation. Your hat told the world who you were. 42 million hats sold in 1900, more hats than adult men in the country. The market seemed not just stable, but eternal. Then came the wars. The first tremor arrived with the soldiers returning from Europe in 1918 and 1919. These men had spent months or years wearing helmets. Heavy, uncomfortable, necessary for survival. When they came home, some found they'd lost the habit of putting anything on their heads at all. The military had trained the formality out of them. Why wear a hat when you'd survived without one? But the real rupture came after the Second War. 8 million veterans flooded American colleges between 1945 and 1952, courtesy of the GI Bill. They brought with them the casual dress of military life, surplus clothing, informal attitudes, a rejection of the rigid social codes their fathers had observed. On campus, hatlessness became almost a uniform. These were men who'd stormed beaches and liberated cities. Nobody was going to tell them they needed to wear a bowler to be taken seriously. A 1947 survey conducted by the Hat Research Foundation, an organization whose very existence testified to the industry's desperation, found that 19% of hatless men cited "because I had to wear a helmet in the Army" as their reason. The association between headwear and trauma was direct and measurable. Hats reminded them of war. By 1948, newspapers were running alarm stories about the barehead fashion. In hat-making towns, people going without hats were reportedly abused by workers who saw their livelihoods being threatened. The industry that had seemed permanent was watching its market evaporate in real time. But veterans and college students were only part of the story. Something else was reshaping American life, something that would do more damage to the hat industry than any fashion trend. Americans were getting into cars. The numbers tell the story of a nation in motion. In 1920, fewer than 1% of Americans owned automobiles. Cars were luxuries, toys for the wealthy, curiosities that most people encountered only on city streets. By 1940, roughly a quarter of the population had access to a car. By 1970, that number had climbed past 55%. The automobile had transformed from novelty to necessity. What does this have to do with hats? Everything. Before automobiles, Americans traveled by public transit, streetcars, trains, buses. These conveyances offered 2 to 3 feet of headroom above a seated passenger. Plenty of space for even the tallest hat. A man could board a trolley wearing a Homburg or a fedora or a Stetson Western, find his seat and ride to his destination without removing his hat or crushing it against the ceiling. Cars were different. Car interiors offered perhaps 2 to 3 inches of clearance above the driver's head. The mathematics were brutal. A man wearing a hat with any substantial crown simply couldn't fit behind the wheel without removing it first, and once removed, the hat became a problem to be solved. Held awkwardly in the lap, tossed onto the passenger seat, crushed between body and door. The hat that had been essential for walking the streets became an impediment to driving them. This wasn't theoretical. You could watch it happen in real time at any parking lot in America. Men arrived wearing hats. They removed them to enter their cars. They drove to their destinations. And increasingly, they didn't bother putting the hats back on when they arrived. Why would they? They'd just have to take them off again when they got back in the car. The 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act accelerated the transformation. President Eisenhower's vision of a 41,000-mile interstate system meant more driving, longer commutes, more time spent in automobiles. The following year, Chrysler and General Motors dramatically lowered their roof heights, prioritizing sleek styling over interior space. The American car was designed for hatless Americans, which in turn created more of them. Robert Krulwich, the journalist whose own father was a hat designer, would later articulate the theory with bleak precision. I blame Ike, because Ike built the highways that created the cars that lowered the roofs that crushed the hats. And then there was climate control. Hats served practical functions beyond fashion. They protected heads from sun, rain, snow, wind. A man walking from his house to the trolley stop, standing on an open platform, transferring to another line, walking from the final stop to his office. That man needed protection from the elements. But a man who walked from his heated house to his heated garage, drove his heated car to his climate-controlled office building, and reversed the journey at day's end. That man experienced weather only in brief intervals between conditioned spaces. The hat had become functionally unnecessary. Central heating, air conditioning, enclosed automobiles. The infrastructure of modern American life was systematically eliminating the practical reasons for wearing hats. What remained was fashion and tradition, and both were eroding. There's a story that gets told about why Americans stopped wearing hats. It goes like this. On January 20th, 1961, John F. Kennedy appeared hatless at his presidential inauguration. The young, glamorous president rejected the stuffy formality of his predecessors, and American men followed his example. Kennedy killed the hat, It's a good story. It's also wrong. The historical record is unambiguous. Kennedy wore a high silk top hat multiple times on Inauguration Day, leaving his home in the morning, traveling with Eisenhower from the White House to the Capitol, arriving at the ceremony, watching the parade from the reviewing stand, attending the inaugural balls that evening. The photographs exist. He wore a hat. He removed it only twice, to be sworn in and to deliver his inaugural address. This was standard protocol. No president had ever given a speech wearing a hat. Lincoln didn't. Roosevelt didn't. Truman didn't. The hatless inauguration speech was tradition, not revolution. Here's the deeper irony. Kennedy actually revived the top hat tradition. Dwight Eisenhower had broken with custom at both his inaugurations, wearing only a Homburg, a less formal choice that itself signaled the declining importance of ceremonial headwear. Kennedy brought back the top hat. He was more traditional than his predecessor, not less. Lyndon Johnson in 1965 was the first president to go completely hatless at his inauguration. But by then, the industry was already in freefall. Johnson didn't kill the hat. He merely acknowledged that it was already dead. The historian Neil Steinberg, in his book Hatless Jack, documented what researchers knew but the public had forgotten. Men's hats didn't die in January 1961. They had already been on the decline for half a century. An organized anti-hat movement among New York college students was noted in the 1920s, 4 decades before Kennedy attended Harvard. The trend was already clear to anyone paying attention. The Kennedy myth persists because it offers a clean narrative, a single event, a single villain, a single moment when everything changed. The truth is messier. The hat industry died from 1,000 cuts. Veterans and automobiles and climate control and changing fashion and the general drift toward informality that characterized post-war America. Kennedy was a symptom, not a cause. A man who happened to be president at the moment when the decline became undeniable. Watch the market disappear in statistics. In 1958, the American fur felt hat market, the core of Stetson's business, stood at over 90,000 dozen units. By 1970, that number had plummeted to 27,000 dozen, a 70% decline in 12 years. Annual hat sales, which had exceeded 42 million in 1900, fell below 2 million by the 1970s, despite the fact that the American population had more than doubled in that time. Per capita hat consumption had collapsed by roughly 95%. The shift was generational and absolute. Young men didn't wear hats. Their fathers had worn hats reluctantly, out of habit and social expectation. Their grandfathers had worn hats as naturally as they wore shoes. Each generation was less attached to headwear than the last, and by the 1960s, the generations who had grown up wearing hats were aging out of the market. The 1960s counterculture accelerated the decline. Hats were establishment. Hats were authority. Hats were everything the youth movement rejected. The Beatles' famous mop tops, carefully cultivated hair that would have been invisible under a hat, became the defining look of a generation. Hairspray became the top-selling beauty product by 1964. Men were investing in their hair in ways that made hats irrelevant, even counterproductive. For the hat industry, these weren't fashion trends to be ridden out. They were extinction events. Chapter 5. The Covenant Broken. The collapse of the hat market was an external force, a change in the world beyond the factory gates. But inside those gates, something else had been breaking for decades. The Great Depression shattered the model John B. Stetson had built. When the economy collapsed in 1929, the company that had prided itself on worker welfare faced an impossible choice. Revenue was falling. Orders were disappearing. The lavish programs that had bound workers to the company, the Christmas bonuses, the annual celebrations, the sense of being part of something larger than a mere job, became luxuries that management could no longer afford. The Christmas parties ended. The bonuses were cut. The company town programs that had defined Stetson's relationship with its workers, the kindergartens, the educational offerings, The elaborate celebrations ceased. Workers who had been taught to think of themselves as family members discovered that family obligations went only so far. And then came the efficiency experts. Management introduced time-motion studies, the systematic measurement of every worker's productivity, the scientific analysis of how long each task should take, the elimination of any movement deemed wasteful. To workers who had spent decades perfecting their craft, who took pride in the quality of their work, the studies felt like an insult. They weren't being evaluated as craftsmen anymore. They were being measured as machines. Anthony Catalano, who worked at Stetson during those years, remembered the transformation. Things got so bad. Lots of time I walked to work, so I could save about 8 cents. It became seasonal work. It went from 12 months, it went down to 10. Then from 10, it went down to 7. From 7, it went to 6. That's why I had to get out of it. 12 months of work became 6. A steady job became a seasonal scramble. The covenant between company and worker, the understanding that loyalty would be rewarded with security, was broken. In 1934, the first collective bargaining unit formed at Stetson. The workers who had resisted unionization for decades, who had accepted paternalism in exchange for generosity, no longer trusted that the exchange was fair. 2 years later, in 1936, they struck. The strike succeeded. Workers won union recognition, a 40-hour work week, and an end to the efficiency studies. Relations between labor and management would be generally amicable in the decades that followed. But something had ended. The Stetson family, that carefully cultivated identity, that sense of shared purpose, was revealed as a transaction. When times got hard, the company had chosen survival over loyalty. Workers learned the lesson and organized accordingly. The company that emerged from World War II was not the company John B. Stetson had built. The war years had provided temporary relief. Military contracts kept production high. American soldiers needed hats, and Stetson made hats. But when the contracts ended, when the soldiers came home and stopped wearing hats, the underlying weakness of the business became impossible to ignore. In 1946, Stetson purchased a plant in Danbury, Connecticut, the former Mallory Hat Company facility, acquired in what looked like an expansion but was really a consolidation. The industry was shrinking, and survivors were absorbing the assets of the fallen. The numbers from 1947 looked respectable, $29 million in revenue. But the numbers were deceiving. Revenue masked a market in structural decline. The customers who had made Stetson dominant were dying or abandoning hats entirely. Each year brought fewer orders, smaller production runs, more idle capacity in that enormous Philadelphia complex. By 1965, the truth could no longer be avoided. The Philadelphia plant, 1.4 million square feet, 25 buildings, the largest hat factory ever built, was too large to be economical. The facility, designed for 5,500 workers making millions of hats per year, couldn't be sustained by a market that had shrunk by 90%. 3 years later, in 1968, revenue had collapsed to $8 million, a 72% decline in 2 decades. The empire that had generated $11 million in 1917, when $11 million was worth 20 times what it was worth in 1968, was generating less in absolute terms than it had half a century earlier. The factory was dying. Everyone who worked there knew it. The question was simply how long the end would take. The Stetson family had run the company for generations. John B.'s son, G. Henry Stetson, had overseen operations after the founder's death. The family name remained on the door, on the sweatbands, on the corporate charter. But by the 1960s, the family's grip was loosening. Stock that had been held by Stetsons was dispersed, sold, transferred. The company that bore the founder's name was becoming something else. An asset to be traded, a brand to be licensed, a problem to be solved by people who had never made a hat in their lives. Ira Gilden entered the picture. Gilden controlled Ramco Enterprises, Incorporated, a holding company with interests far removed from hat making. He began acquiring Stetson stock in the mid-1960s. accumulating a working control by 1966 and a majority interest by 1968. G. Henry Stetson, the founder's son living in California, watching his family's legacy pass into outside hands, threatened litigation, arguing that the price being paid for the stock was inadequate. The litigation went nowhere. By the end of the decade, Gildan controlled the company. Philip A. Roth became president, tasked with finding a path forward for a business that seemed to have no future. The path they chose was retreat. The company that had built an empire on manufacturing, on the belief that quality required control of every step from raw fur to finished hat, would become a licensing operation. The Stetson name would survive. The Stetson factory would not. Chapter 6. The End of the Line. Sometime in 1970 or 1971, the exact date varies by source, as if history itself couldn't bear to pin down the moment, the John B. Stetson Company announced its decision. The Philadelphia factory would close. Manufacturing would cease. The company would convert from making hats to licensing the right to make hats bearing the Stetson name. The stated reasons were familiar. Decades of changing fashions, an outdated facility unable to compete with smaller and more nimble operations, labor union issues that had complicated the final years. The 1.4 million square foot plant was simply too large to be economical in a market that had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. These reasons were true. They were also incomplete. The decision to close the factory was the final act in a tragedy that had been unfolding for decades. Every choice along the way had its own logic: cutting benefits during the Depression, introducing efficiency studies, acquiring competitors, reducing the workforce as orders declined. Each decision seemed reasonable at the time. Each decision narrowed the options for what came next. The men who made the final call, Gildan, Roth, the board that approved the closure, weren't villains. They were businessmen confronting a business that no longer worked. The market for hats had collapsed. The facility was too large. The losses were mounting. What were they supposed to do? Keep making hats that no one would buy? Keep paying workers to produce goods that would sit unsold in warehouse? Perhaps they believed they had no choice. Perhaps they couldn't see any alternative. Perhaps, standing at the end of a long decline, they did the only thing that seemed possible. They stopped. But the workers who had given their lives to that factory, who had followed their fathers through those gates and expected their sons to follow them, those workers experienced the decision differently. To them, it wasn't business logic. It was betrayal. The factory didn't close all at once. It wound down in stages, the workforce shrinking month by month, department by department, until the final workers completed the final tasks and walked out of the building for the last time. 106 years. That's how long Stetson had operated in Philadelphia. From that single room at 7th and Callowhill in 1865 to the sprawling complex at 4th and Montgomery in 1971. More than a century of hat-making, of employment, of community. The workers who remained at the end were the ones who couldn't leave. Too old to start over. Too invested in pensions that would evaporate if they quit before the closure. Too attached to the work itself. The craft they had spent decades mastering. The skills that had no application outside those walls. Kate Karzik worked at Stetson in the 1960s during the long decline. By then, she remembered most of her co-workers had moved away from Kensington to Northeast Philadelphia, commuting to a factory that no longer sat at the center of their lives. The Christmas parties for neighborhood children were long gone. The company that had once shaped every aspect of workers' existence had shrunk to just a job, and a precarious one at that. The neighborhood felt the withdrawal before the closure made it official. Shops that had served factory workers for generations saw their customer base dwindling. Bars that had filled at shift change found themselves empty earlier and earlier. The rhythm of the community, tied for over a century to the rhythm of the factory, was losing its beat. Then the machines stopped. The last hat was blocked, trimmed, inspected, and shipped. The workers punched out for the final time. The bell that had marked the start and end of shifts for decades rang once more. And then, silence. After the closure, the complex sat vacant. 9 acres of industrial archaeology, waiting for someone to decide what it should become. The city found a temporary use. 63,000 square feet of the facility housed a manpower training program from 1971 to 1976. Workers who had lost jobs in Philadelphia's industrial collapse came to the building to learn new skills. The irony was almost too heavy to bear. Men being retrained for a new economy in a building that embodied the death of the old one. In May of 1977, the Stetson Company donated the entire 8.95-acre site and all its buildings to the city of Philadelphia. It was a gift that no one quite knew how to receive. Plans circulated for preserving the newer buildings, adapting them for other uses. The clock tower, the auditorium, the gymnasium, these structures had historical significance, architectural merit, community meaning. They could be saved. They could become something new. The plans never materialized. In 1979, the city made its decision. Most of the complex would be demolished. 21 of the 25 buildings came down that year, reduced to rubble and carted away. The bricks that had housed 5,500 workers, that had processed 16 million pelts a year, that had produced the hats that conquered the American West, those bricks became landfill. 4 structures remained standing, buildings 10 through 13, including the 8-story clock tower, the 5,500-seat auditorium, the gymnasium, and the fitting room. These were slated for preservation and rehabilitation. The city recognized their value, their history, their potential. They stood empty, waiting, deteriorating. Chapter 7. Fire and Ash. September 4th, 1980. Arsonists entered the remaining factory buildings sometime after dark. The fire they set spread through structures that had stood empty for years, their interiors dry, their wooden floors and supports ready to burn. By the time firefighters arrived, the blaze was beyond control. The 8-story clock tower collapsed. The 5,500-seat auditorium, once the largest permanent hall in Philadelphia, where President Taft had spoken and Billy Sunday had preached, and Christmas turkeys had been distributed to married men, fell in on itself. The gymnasium, the fitting room, the structures that were supposed to be preserved, all of them consumed. The great Stetson bell, which had marked the rhythms of the factory for nearly 90 years, crashed down through the burning floors and landed in the ash, 2,500 pounds of bronze silenced forever. Firefighters recovered the bell from the wreckage. In the days that followed, a teenager reportedly approached the Philadelphia Historical Commission with an offer. He had the bell's clapper and would return it for $150. Richard Tyler, the commission's preservation officer, declined. The bell went into storage at the Atwater Kent Museum, joining over 130,000 other artifacts in the city's historical collection. There it remained, unseen and largely forgotten, for nearly 40 years, a 2,500-pound memorial to an empire that had vanished. What the arsonists destroyed wasn't just buildings. It was the physical evidence of what Stetson had been. The tower that had dominated the neighborhood skyline. The auditorium that had held the entire workforce at once. The bell that had called generations of workers to their stations. All of it gone in a single night. Whether the fire was set deliberately to destroy history, or whether it was simply vandalism that spiraled beyond intention, no one can say for certain. The motive died with the flames. What remained was absence. One building still stands from the Stetson era. The hospital on the 1700 block of North 4th Street, opened in 1905, renovated in 1936, survived the fire, survived the demolition, survived the decades of neglect that claimed everything else. It stands today in a neighborhood that would be unrecognizable to the workers who once streamed through these streets. The hospital's current function carries its own weight. After serving workers in the Kensington community until 1970, The building was converted to drug treatment services. Today, it houses JEVS Act II, providing methadone maintenance, psychiatric treatment, and HIV and hepatitis testing. The same walls that once treated Hatter's shakes, the tremors and personality changes and memory loss that came from mercury exposure in the felting process, now treat a different epidemic. The neighborhood that was built by industry has been hollowed out by its absence. The building that healed workers now treats the casualties of a community in crisis. There's continuity here, if you look for it. The recognition that people need care. The understanding that a building can serve its community across generations, even as the community transforms. John B. Stetson believed that providing for workers was both moral and practical. The hospital he built has outlasted everything else he created, still providing for a community he wouldn't recognize. But the continuity is bitter as well as sweet. The hospital survives because the need for care survives, and the need has changed in ways that testify to what was lost. In 2019, 39 years after it crashed into the ash of the burned auditorium, the Stetson bell was retrieved from storage. Robert Blackson, director of Temple Contemporary, the university's public art program, discovered the bell during research into Kensington's industrial history. He arranged for its display, bringing the artifact out of obscurity for the first time since the fire. The exhibition was temporary, a chance for Philadelphia to see what had been hidden for decades. A 2,500-pound remnant of an empire that had employed thousands, shaped a neighborhood, conquered the American West, and disappeared. Visitors who encountered the bell were seeing something most of them had never known existed. The Stetson factory was history, not the vivid living history that survivors can testify to, but the dusty archival history that requires explanation. The bell sat there, mute, offering no context beyond its mass and its survival. But for those who knew what to listen for, the bell still spoke. It spoke of mornings when 5,500 workers heard its call and began their shifts. It spoke of evenings when the same workers heard it again and walked home to Kensington row houses. It spoke of Christmas celebrations and union meetings and the ordinary rhythms of a factory that ran for over a century. And it spoke of the silence that followed, the years when the bell lay in storage, forgotten. The decades when the neighborhood that had grown around the factory struggled with the absence that the factory left behind. A bell is meant to be heard. This one has been silent for more than 40 years. The exodus of industry from North Philadelphia left entire neighborhoods physically and spiritually gutted. Those words come from Philaplace, the historical organization that has documented what happened to communities like Kensington, and the words are carefully chosen. This wasn't just economic decline. It was the destruction of a way of life. Stetson was one factory among many. Kensington, in 1928, housed 350 textile firms alone. The neighborhood's nickname, the workshop of the world, was earned by the density of production that happened in those blocks. Hats and textiles and machinery and leather goods, all manufactured within walking distance of each other, all employing workers who lived within walking distance of their jobs. By the early 1980s, that world had collapsed. Between 1979 and 1983, Philadelphia lost 100,000 manufacturing jobs. The factories that had sustained Kensington for generations closed one after another, some moving south for cheaper labor, some moving overseas, some simply failing as markets shifted and costs rose, and the economics of American manufacturing changed. The neighborhood that had been built for workers became a neighborhood without work. House values plummeted. When a factory closes, the workers who depended on it can't sell their homes, not for anything close to what they paid, not when everyone is trying to sell at the same time, not when the buyers who might have been interested are losing their jobs too. Families who had invested their savings in Kensington row houses found themselves trapped in a declining market, watching their equity evaporate. The supporting businesses followed the factories down. The bars and diners and shops that had served workers for generations lost their customer base. Banks closed branches. Churches that had anchored ethnic communities saw their congregations scatter. Schools that had educated workers' children emptied out as families left for anywhere that offered opportunity. What remained was poverty. And with poverty came everything that accompanies it: crime, addiction, despair. Abandoned buildings attracted squatters and dealers. Empty lots became dumping grounds. The physical infrastructure that had supported a working community deteriorated without the tax base to maintain it. Today, Kensington is notorious. The neighborhood's open-air drug market draws national attention, a visible symbol of the opioid crisis that has devastated communities across America. The streets where hatters once walked to work are now documented by journalists and filmmakers recording a different kind of American tragedy. The connection between then and now isn't simple. Decades separate the factory closures from the current crisis. The opioid epidemic has causes that extend far beyond deindustrialization. But the vulnerability, the hollowing out of a community's economic base, the destruction of the institutions that once provided stability, that vulnerability was created when the factories left. Chapter 8. The Ghost Brand. The Stetson brand didn't die with the Philadelphia factory. It transformed. After the 1971 closure, manufacturing rights were licensed to Stevens Hat Manufacturing Company in St. Joseph, Missouri. The hats that bore the Stetson name were no longer made in Philadelphia, no longer made by workers whose families had mastered the craft over generations. But they were still made. The company went through bankruptcy in 1986, following the death of Ira Gilden. Hat Brands Incorporated acquired the Stetson division in 1990. Today, RHE Hatco Incorporated manufactures Stetson hats in Garland, Texas, using felt produced at a plant in Longview. Remarkably, some of the original machinery, equipment dating to the 1890s designed for a process that John B. Stetson himself would have recognized, still operates on the Texas factory floor. The craft continues even if the place has changed. The brand is now owned by an anonymous family that has been in the Western business since the 1960s. Robert Dundon, who became CEO in 2023, oversees a company producing approximately 500,000 hats annually. Business has grown in double digits every year since 2021. The Stetson name still appears on products far beyond hats. Boots. Sales have doubled yearly for 2 years running. Apparel. Fragrances, including the Stetson cologne that debuted in 1981. Eyewear. Bourbon. The company that once meant one thing, hats made in Philadelphia by craftsmen who had dedicated their lives to the work, now means a lifestyle brand spanning multiple categories. In 2024, Stetson created the hat that Beyoncé wore on the cover of her Cowboy Carter album. The image circled the globe, introducing the brand to audiences who had never heard of John B. Stetson, who had no idea that hats were once made in Philadelphia, who simply saw a hat that looked right and assumed it had always existed. The brand celebrated its 160th anniversary in 2025. 160 years from that single room at 7th and Callowhill, from the $100 and the $10 worth of beaver fur, from the dying man who went west and came back with an idea. The name survives. The factory that built it is gone. Chapter 9. The silence stand on the corner of 4th Street and Montgomery Avenue today. The clock tower that once dominated the skyline isn't there. The auditorium that held 5,500 seats isn't there. The factory complex that sprawled across 9 acres, that employed 5,000 workers, that produced millions of hats that conquered the American West. None of it is there. What remains is an absence shaped like a history. The hospital still stands, a few blocks away. It serves a different purpose now, treating a different affliction, but it stands. The bell exists somewhere, retrieved from storage for a temporary exhibition, its current location uncertain. The name exists, too, on hats made in Texas, on bottles of bourbon, on a brand that has outlived the thing it once described. But the factory is gone. The workers are gone. Those who remain are in their 80s and 90s, carrying memories that will disappear when they do. The community that grew around the factory has been transformed into something its founders wouldn't recognize. Walk these blocks on a quiet morning before the traffic picks up, before the ordinary noise of the city drowns out everything else. Listen. You won't hear the machinery, the hum that once carried for blocks in every direction, that you could feel through the soles of your feet. It stopped 50 years ago. You won't hear the factory whistle calling workers to their shifts. You won't hear the Singer 103 sewing machines, the hiss of steam, the thump of blocking presses. What you'll hear is silence, the particular silence of a place that was built for noise. A silence that testifies to what used to be, to what was built and lost and forgotten. John Batterson Stetson was supposed to die young. A doctor told him so. Tuberculosis, only a short time to live. He went west to see something before the end, and instead he found the idea that would make him one of the most successful manufacturers in American history. He built a factory that became an empire. He built an empire that shaped a neighborhood, a city, a culture. The hats that bore his name sat on the heads of cowboys and presidents, movie stars and working men, anyone who wanted to signal something about who they were and what they valued. He built a system that treated workers as something more than labor, a system that was paternalistic, certainly, calculated in its generosity, designed to prevent unionization as much as to provide care, but a system that also meant something to the people who lived within it. The hospital that treated their children, the building and loan that helped them own homes, the Christmas celebrations that gathered the whole community in one room. All of it is gone now. The factory, the complex, the community it sustained, demolished, burned, scattered to the winds. What remains is a single hospital building, a bell in storage, and a name that appears on products made 1,000 miles from Philadelphia. The workers who spent their lives in that factory are nearly gone too. The testimonies they left behind, recorded in oral histories, preserved in archives, capture fragments of what it was like. The pride in the work, the rhythm of the days, the moment when they realized it was ending and there was nothing they could do. Mike Korsnack worked at Stetson for 52 years and 9 months. Mildred Schaefline's father worked there for 50 years and 3 months. John Rudolph started in 1917 at age 16 because everyone in the neighborhood wanted to get into Stetson. These were lives shaped by a single factory, a single employer, a single set of gates that they walked through thousands of times. Those gates don't exist anymore. The building they led to doesn't exist. The industry that the building served has contracted to a shadow of what it was. But for a century, from 1865 to 1971, this corner of Philadelphia produced something that mattered. Hats that lasted, jobs that built lives, a community that existed because the factory existed. Stand here long enough and you can almost imagine it. The building rising above you, the bell marking the hour, the workers streaming through the gates for another shift, another day, another hat moving down the line. Almost. What remains is the weight of what was lost, the silence where the machinery used to be, the empty lot where an empire stood, and the question that hangs over this place, the question that hangs over every ruined factory in America. What happens when the thing that gave a place its reason for being simply disappears? The answer is here, in the weeds pushing through the concrete, in the hospital treating addictions where it once treated workers, in the bell that no one hears anymore. The answer is silence. The answer is what remains.